The Las Vegas Raiders finished the 2023 season with an 8-9 record and missed the playoffs for the second straight year. It was an up and down year for the Raiders as they had some very high highs, like the 2-week span when they obliterated the Chargers on Thursday night to the tune of a 63-21 victory, and the following week when they beat the Chiefs on Christmas Day in Arrowhead with a score of 20-14. A lot of people were hesitant about the Raiders heading into the 2023 season due to their lack of belief in former head coach Josh McDaniels, and they were right, as McDaniels was fired after a loss to the Lions on Monday night, which set Las Vegas back to 3-5 through 8 games. But after McDaniels was fired, interim Antonio Pierce took over, and the energy throughout the locker room and the energy you saw the players have on the field when AP took over was noticeable. And they went 5-4 with Antonio Pierce down the stretch, and the Raiders rewarded him and took the interim part off of his job title, as he is now the Raiders head coach. And the Raiders have a lot of talented players, and they are going to be a tough and nasty team to beat entering the 2024 season, but there's two big concerns I have with the 2024 Raiders that I can't help but think they are set up to fail. I like a lot of things the Raiders did this offseason, but it's going to be a long way back to the top, and we're going to break everything down in today's video. Now let's begin. And we are starting today's video by breaking down who the Raiders acquired in free agency and, of course, who they lost in free agency. The Raiders spent a lot of money on one player, which was former Dolphins defensive tackle Christian Wilkins. They gave Christian a 4-year, $110 million contract with 82 of it being guaranteed. That is an enormous amount of guaranteed for Wilkins, but Christian has been a very good player for the Dolphins over the past few years. And like we've said with other teams that have shelled out big contracts this offseason, most notably Calvin Ridley getting $92 million from Tennessee, and Danielle Hunter getting 48 of his $49 million guaranteed from Houston, paying him is not a problem because it's not like Las Vegas won't have the money to be able to pay an up-and-coming quarterback $55 million or more per year. I like this signing a lot for the Raiders because of what Wilkins represents. He is a very good player, and over the past 3 years, he has accrued double-digit TFLs in all 3 seasons, and even had 2 seasons with 85 or more tackles in 2021 and 2022. He had a career-high 9 sacks in 2023, and also had 23 quarterback hits. And one of the big reasons I like this signing for the Raiders is because of how they're going to try and win games for the next few years. Max Crosby is a freak, and I really think he is one of the most underappreciated players in all of football. And whenever you think of the Raiders, you probably think of Max or Devontae Adams, and it makes sense, as they are the Raiders' 2 best players. But aside from just saying, yeah, Max is good and he's a really good pass rusher, I don't think there's a lot of recognition past the fact he's a really good player. He has had over 80 pressures in each of the last 3 years, which is insane, and I would expect that to continue this year. But the Raiders also had a player go under the radar last year in Malcolm Kuntz, who had over 50 pressures and had 8 sacks in 2023. Malcolm played really well in his role, and at the moment at least, the production of Malcolm Kuntz kind of takes the heat off of the lackluster rookie season Tyree Wilson had. So entering 2024, the Raiders have a very good defensive line in Crosby, Wilkins, and Kuntz. And in the best case scenario, Tyree Wilson steps up this year and becomes a contributing player. But another reason why I liked the Wilkins signing so much was because there's only so much an opposing offensive line can do against a good pass rush. And the reality is, the Raiders are going to need all of these guys to have career years this year because of how thin the secondary is. Now, I am a firm believer that a good pass rush, or in the Raiders' case, a great pass rush, can negate a bad secondary. To a degree, that is. And this is one of the biggest concerns I have with the 2024 Raiders, and that's their corners. Jack Jones played solid for the Raiders in 2023, and the hope is he stays at that level, and if he does, the Raiders will have a solid number 1 corner. Not elite or best in the league by any means, but a solid number 1 corner. Nate Hobbs played well in the slot for Las Vegas last year, but after that, it gets thin and quick. Their 3rd and 4th corners are Brandon Facyson and Jacorian Bennett, both who have struggled at the NFL level. Brandon Facyson played just 3 games for the Raiders last year and will turn 30 in September, and Jacorian Bennett was a 4th-round pick in the 2023 draft, who especially struggled during his rookie year. And the concern I have with the Raiders entering 2024 is, over the course of a 17-game season, how will injuries play out? That's the million-dollar question nobody knows at this point, and I understand you can do this with every team, but the Raiders' secondary is very thin, and I worry big time that if Nate Hobbs or Jack Jones misses a game, let alone multiple, that the opposing offense is going to purposely attack whoever is at the second corner position and basically say, stop us. And not only that, but the Raiders' run defense wasn't the best last year, and if teams can stretch the Raiders horizontally and get the ground game going, and especially early, I think that would only be setting the Raiders up to fail. And one other concern I have with this team is they are not built to play from behind. One of the big things we discussed on the channel, and frequently at that, is teams' ability to play complementary football, and that was not something the Raiders did well in 2023. And we will break this down more during the Raiders' offensive portion of the video, but one of the Raiders' biggest losses from 23 to 24 was running back Josh Jacobs. Jacobs had over 1,100 yards from scrimmage last year, and the Raiders really could not run the football, nearly at all. They finished 28th in yards per carry and were in the bottom half of the NFL in every other rushing category too. And in turn, how did this affect the Raiders' defense last year? Well, they were 27th in opposing average time per possession, which adds up pretty quick to the amount of plays an opposing offense is running and how often the defense is on the field. One thing I fully understand the Raiders, nor anybody, has control over is who they play and especially when they play. And after Antonio Pierce took over, yes, they started out with 2 wins, but they were home against the Giants and Jets, both of whom had top 10 picks in the 2024 draft. Yes, they pummeled the Giants in a 30-6 win, and I know Daniel Jones got hurt in this game, but the Raiders played really good team football, which was a breath of fresh air. But after the 2 games against bad New York teams, they lost on the road to Miami, and credit to them, they got out to a 14-0 lead against the Chiefs, before unfortunately being outscored 31-3 the rest of the way, to lose with a final score of 31-17. Their next 2 wins in the Antonio Pierce era were against the Chargers, which was a pummeling, and the Chiefs on Christmas Day. My biggest gripe with the Raiders entering the 24 season is how much I think the offense is going to hold the defense back, because in a perfect world, the Raiders could be a similar team like the Titans back in 2021 in the sense of playing clean football, playing good defense, and committing to running the football. And if you go back and look, the 2021 Titans actually finished 23rd in turnovers that year, as they committed 25 turnovers in 17 games. But they committed 13 turnovers in 3 games, which were very clear outliers, and had just 12 turnovers in the other 14 games. That would be the ideal vision for the Raiders, and to be able to have Max, Christian, Malcolm, and the pass rush, hopefully Tyree too for that matter, get after the quarterback, and have Robert Spillane, Divine Diablo, and Trayvon Merrick take care of the rest. But in the loaded AFC, I can't help but think of how limited the Raiders are going to be this year. Now, I do want to credit the Raiders for beating the Chiefs on Christmas Day, truly, as that is an insane accomplishment that not a lot of teams can say. But the Chiefs going 10-1 in the remaining 11 games against the Raiders since the start of 2018 suggests that's an outlier game rather than the standard. And my biggest question, even for Raiders fans, is entering the year when you play the Mahomes, Burrows, and Lamars of the world, and they play all of them this year, when it comes hell or high water, realistically, who are you choosing to win the game? Are you going to trust Aiden O'Connell to lead this team into M&T Bank Stadium in Week 2 to beat the Ravens on the road? I personally would not, and that's a shame because of everything the Raiders did right this offseason from a culture standpoint and from flat-out improving the roster from 2023 to 2024. And despite how good I think the Raiders' defense can be, and ultimately will be at times, I think the big question that it all boils down to for the 2024 Raiders is, for what? The 2024 Raiders offense is one out of the 32 teams that, I gotta be honest, I have internally struggled with how to go about talking about this unit, and I prepared quite a while before turning on the camera and recording this and going from here. And I think the biggest thing that needs to be kind of evened out, if you will, with the 2024 Raiders offense is expectations. Because I think there are some Raiders fans, granted this is, I'm talking less than 5%, that will tell you to look at the final 4 games of the year in which Aiden O'Connell led the team to a 3-1 finish, which, by the way, I know Aiden didn't play a huge part in this game, but including a win over the Chiefs in Arrowhead on Christmas Day. But they'll tell you that they led to a 3-1, 8 touchdowns in the final 4 games, and he had over 850 passing yards in those final 4 games. And then there will be kind of the opposite end where he was okay, and we're in the AFC. We really shouldn't expect too much from AOC or Gardner Minshew this year, and there's, both sides of that discussion. Now, for me personally, regarding the quarterbacks, I don't think AOC or Gardner Minshew are going to be top 15, top 17 quarterbacks this year. I think they're going to be near the bottom half of the league in terms of what they get out of their starting quarterbacks. It is worth noting that there's several players I like on the 2024 Raiders offense, most notably Davante Adams, but I also really like Colton Miller. I like Dylan Parham. I thought he was a great value pick in the 2023 draft in the 3rd round. I also think center Andre James is one of the most underrated players in all of football, and I think he's quietly a really, really good starter for them, and one of my favorite picks in the entire 2024 draft that if you are a Raiders fan, you may remember him being a part of the draft steal video, was right guard Jackson Powers Johnson. JPJ was absolutely one of my favorite players in the 2024 draft, and I thought JPJ was always going to be a guy that teams simply overlooked, and I know it's not quite the same, but I think that also applies to Ravens center Tyler Linderbaum from a couple of years ago, and I think Jackson Powers Johnson can be a Pro Bowl level offensive lineman. But the big question is, what can we expect out of the quarterback position? And like I said, I think it's going to be in the bottom half in terms of production. And I think the big question is, for the 2024 Raiders, when you are playing the elite teams, when you're not playing teams that you should be, like the Panthers, for example, or like another team that finished with a top 3 or a bottom 3 or 4 draft pick last year, you should beat those teams. But what are they going to do when they go to Kansas City? And I know technically they have a 1-game winning streak in Arrowhead. I get that. But what are you going to do when it comes hell or high water? And for me as an analyst to sit here and say, I'm going to trust Aiden O'Connell to lead this team into Buffalo and to beat Josh Allen and the Bills is not something I'm going to do. I don't believe that, and that's one of my biggest holdups with the 2024 Raiders. To be completely honest, I think this team has several players that are under the radar in terms of how good they are relative to the national media buzz that they receive. Of course, we just discussed the offensive line, and to be honest, I know Michael Mayer didn't have the best rookie season, but I really still think there's a lot of room for him to grow, and it wouldn't surprise me at all if the Raiders have 2 tight ends this year with over 400 yards receiving, and of course the other would be first-round pick Brock Bowers. From a yards and points per game standpoint, I think Las Vegas will be right around middle of the pack, anywhere from 16th through the 22nd position, somewhere in there. I'm also not entirely sold on Zamir White the way I know some other Raiders fans are, and what also has to be remembered with Zamir White, this doesn't apply to him, but it applies to every other starting running back in the NFL, is if he goes down, which is possible with a 17-game season, considering how much running backs get beat up and bruised and battered throughout the course of a season, I do not trust Alexander Mattison at all as his backup. Mattison was given the keys last year in Minnesota, and he produced a grand total of 0 rushing touchdowns, and to me was a liability in the backfield. Now, there's going to be games where the Raiders flash. There's going to be games where AOC has 275, maybe even 300 passing yards, but I don't think that's something that should be expected from him every single week. I don't think he should be expected to have 4,000 or 4,400 passing yards this year or anything crazy. But can he simply not lose games? And if he cannot lose games and let the defense, kind of pin their ears back, let Max Crosby, Christian Wilkins, Malcolm Kuntz get after the quarterback, hopefully Tyree Wilson there as well, then I think the Raiders can have a pretty high floor. But a lot of that is going to depend on the offense. As simple as this concept sounds, as long as the offense is just not brutally bad, which I don't think they're going to be, as long as they're not awful, the Raiders can have a very high floor led by head coach Antonio Pierce. The 2024 Raiders rookie impact is undoubtedly going to be highlighted by 2 players, which of course are Brock Bowers and Jackson Powers Johnson, their first 2 draft picks. We went over JPJ during the offensive portion of the video, and I think he's going to be a plug-and-play player for at least the next 6 or 7 years, and I think there's going to be times, kind of like Colton Miller now, where he has his spot solidified along the offensive line. Don't play with fire, just let him cook, let him be him, and he's going to be fine. And I mean that in the absolute best way possible, and anytime you can take a player that's going to be a plug-and-play for 6, 7, maybe 9 or 10 years if you're lucky, go for it. And I think that's what they have in Jackson Powers Johnson. Now, with Brock Bowers, he's a little more interesting to discuss, not just because he was the best tight end prospect in the draft, but because they took a tight end in the top 35 last year in Michael Mayer, and I think there is a reality where both exist. From a stat sheet standpoint this year, I think Brock will be right around 500 or 600 yards. I don't think, especially with Jacoby Myers and of course Davante Adams in the same offense, that we're going to see a generational type rookie year from Brock Bowers, and I know Sam Laporta was selected a lot later last year than what Bowers was this year, early part of the second round, but Laporta had 880 yards and 10 touchdowns, and to be honest, I would be floored if Brock Bowers is close to that. I think it'll be, like I said, around 500 or 600 yards, and probably around 5 or 6 touchdowns as well, which is fine, by the way, because the tight end position is a very difficult position to transition to from the collegiate level to the NFL level. Their third-round pick was tackle Delmar Glaze, and anytime you can have a 6th offensive lineman that can add some power and add some beef inside the 5-yard line in the red zone, especially with 17 games, I'm all for it because he can give that little extra push along when you're trying to get into the end zone, and hopefully Zamir White follows DJ Glaze into the end zone a couple times this year. One pick that I think could have some impact is running back Dylan Labe. Dylan was a running back from New Hampshire who is most notable for having a 300-plus yard receiving, not rushing, but 300-yard receiving game during his collegiate time at New Hampshire. So he could be a threat out of the backfield. That is, of course, worth noting. And the other pick that I wanted to highlight was 7th-round DB MJ Devonshire, who would be a good nickel corner, or at least the backup nickel corner for the Raiders this year. And, of course, with injuries that are going to happen over the course of a 17-game season, Devonshire could absolutely see the field for the Raiders this year. I really love the potential of Brock Bowers and Jackson Powers-Johnson, and I think this class over the course of time will prove to be a pretty good draft class overall. The 2024 Raiders record breakdown depends, to me, on quarterback more than any other team in the league, really outside of the Colts, depending on how much you believe in Anthony Richardson. I think there is a very real possibility that the Raiders start out with a 1-3 record. They play at the Chargers in Week 1, which I think they can lose. Then they play Baltimore in Week 2 in Baltimore, which I think they will lose. Then come home to play Carolina, which I think they will win. Then come home to play Cleveland, which I think they will lose. Starting out 1-3 is very tough to come back from, especially in the AFC, and there is a 5 or 6 game stretch later in the year that I don't think the Raiders are going to fare too well. And even in the best case scenario, if they start out 2-2, because I think at minimum they will lose to the Ravens and Browns, this 5 or 6 game stretch later in the year starts right before their Week 10 bye, as they go to Cincy in Week 9, then have the Week 10 bye, then go to Miami, then come home to play Denver, which they absolutely can beat, and ultimately I think for that matter can sweep the Broncos, but then they go to KC and Tampa Bay in back-to-back weeks. And I think when you go to Cincinnati, go to Miami, and then have that Kansas City and Tampa, that those games in those consecutive weeks, I think there's at least 3 or 4 more losses for the Raiders right there, which would put them at around 5 or 6 losses, and this all kind of boils down into the team ceiling for me, which is around 8 wins. I don't think this team is going to make the playoffs this year, but I do think positively, I think they're going to be a pain in the rear end to play, and I think they're going to be an incredibly tough team to beat every single week, but I think the Raiders for 2024 are a team that needs a lot of things to go right for them to win a game, meaning they have to win games in very specific ways, kind of like the Steelers were last year, but that's not necessarily a bad thing because the Steelers still won 10 games and they still made the playoffs. I just don't think the Raiders are a serious threat this year, and I think that boils down to the quarterback and the running back position, and of course the secondary outside of the top corner. But that's all I have for the 2024 Raiders team preview. I hope you enjoyed, and if you did, please like and subscribe, as only about 40% of people watching are subscribed and helps the channel tremendously. Until next time, please be safe and have a great day. Love you guys.